And lastly, we can look at the chance. So for the chance, if we're looking at the TVO charts, market share charts alone, you probably think that there is no clear winner here. Because if you look at all these major chains, their market shares at the very beginning of this year is actually pretty much the same or somewhat less than the market share they have near the end of 2025. And then actually most of the market share actually goes to plasma. However, whether the market share of plasma here is sustainable and organic or not is still uncertain because plasma, since it's TGE, been heavily incentivizing lending, borrowing, and also all DeFi activities like swap on the chain. And right now, we still don't know if the incentive stops, whether the TVO will stay. So if you're looking at the TVO market share chart alone, it's really hard to say who is winning throughout 2025. However, if you look at the volume, it actually presents a different picture. You will see Solana dominated most of the DEX swap volume throughout the 2025. Even though the volume shrink a little bit, however, near the year end of 2025, it looks like Solana finds a new narrative and the volumes pick up again. So at the very beginning of 2025, it was mostly about meme coins, was mostly about small cap altcoins. However, near the end of Q1, most of the meme coins were pretty much dead or become very quiet. So you can see that for near the end of Q1, Q2 to Q3, the volume of Solana market share was actually shrinking. However, near the end of Q3 and then in Q4, the volume start to pick up again. So that is due to the rise of the next chain DeFi protocol on Solana. These protocols are more about yield-bearing stables, are more about creating native yield on Solana, leveraging, for example, like the Unitas, like Hilos, the Hash, and also like Cash. Stablecoin issuers are only live in Solana in Q3 or Q4. And the birth of this protocol helped the lending protocols such as Camino and Jupiter Land find a new narrative and also help spot DEX such as Orca, Radiant, and new spot DEX to survive and grow because right now they contributed a lot of the swap on Solana. In terms of the winner is definitely Solana. They found their new narrative and still maintain to be the top one across all the chain, even when compared with Ethereum. And as for that chain that's interesting to look at is probably BSC. So we just mentioned that Binance Alpha, all the swap volume mostly take place on PancakeSwap on BSC. And you can see that it's actually what's the chart saying here. Binance Alpha first launched near the end of April, and that's when the trading volume market share spike for BSC. And then near the end of Q2 and in Q3, market was less hype about BSC. However, the market balance contributed a lot of volume even to this state. And then you can see that near the end of Q3 or early Q4, the BSC volume pick up again. That is due to the launch of Aster. So Aster launched and then it worked pretty well together with Binance Alpha because a lot of protocol choose to launch on Aster and also launch on the Binance Alpha. And with that, people have more fundings to trade one token to arbitrage, and they also running the incentive campaign together. For example, for people trading on Binance Alpha, they can get some reward on Aster or vice versa. So they help to sustain the momentum of Binance Alpha there, and also contribute to a lot of BSC volume. And for the rest of the chains, one of the chains that been probably doing somewhat okay is probably Base, but you can see that it's basically merely holding up its market share. BSC, beginning of the 2025, it was doing okay due to the meme coins. However, later on, it was struggling to find new narratives. For example, the X402. And then later in the year, they were talking about something like the tokenized stock. However, right now, it's actually doing better than the Base for tokenized stock. In terms of related DeFi market, it's also doing better than Base in the sense that right now, users already borrow with the tokenized stock, can also loop or even LP with the tokenized stock on Solana on different kind of DEX and lending protocol. So Base is also not doing terribly, but merely for it is pulling out the trading volume. And for the rest of the majors, for example, like Avalanche, Sui, and also the Arbitrum and Hyperliquid, they were struggling to attract the volume because volume, you need to have the volume first to attract LPs. However, you also need to have the LP first to attract the volumes. So it's very hard to co-start and attract the volume after they lost them to the other chains. And throughout 2025, Arbitrum introduced the drip program, trying to make it easier for people to swap the correlated pairs. But as you can see, when it's launched, it Linea and Plasma, and later on are all doing similar programs, so the effects are actually hard to tell from charts. However, thanks to this campaign doing better than Avalanche and also Sui, on both of these chains, no narrative is going on. Their market share is also shrinking. And for Hyperliquid, market first expected a lot from the launch of Felix and then also launch like USDHL. However, they realized that there is no utility for stablecoins. And if I want to swap, I might as well just swap on, for example, Hyperliquid. But Hyperliquid mostly about perps. Given that there's no native earning stable, there is no swap at all on Hyperliquid. So you can see that in the Q2 and also Q3 volume pickup, and that is when people were talking about like USDHL, we're talking about Phyllis, we're talking about Morpho, Hyperliquid, we're talking about Loop, Hype, Wrap HLP. They can also probably run base trading strategies on Hyperliquid and then create a tokenized strategy and then build a new strategy on top of it. But when the market pivoted and then when the funding rate dropped, also when the API of Wrap HLP dropped, the volume of Hyperliquid dropped together. And that's for Hyperliquid. And lastly, for Plasma, even though it's running the incentive program, but similar to Hyperliquid, there is just not enough native yield available Plasma for people to swap and build loop. And yeah, so in terms of the TVOs, 2025 is actually hard for them because their market shares are all mostly the same or lower. Only Plasma quite a lot of market share, but that is due to the incentive program. And then in terms of the volume, Solana is doing pretty good, and that next one is BSC, which is working very well together with Binance. And then the base is also trying to catch up. And for the rest of the chains, there's just not much going on for them.